This is Can I Laugh on Your Shoulder?
Today is a day that I have had circled on my calendar for a very long time. Well, actually not a very long time. I just knew that this was going to be happening for a very long time. And the day is here, and that is my very good friend, Steve Bezner, is my guest on the podcast today. Steve, welcome.
I am so glad to be here, Molly. Thank you for having me on today.
I'm so excited. We met about 2.5 years ago when my friend Sharon Hottie Miller and I came to Houston. And you took me to a gas station so I could get Fountain Diet Coke. And I was like, wow, this guy is my friend. We've had Tex-Mex together. And then you finally got to meet my husband. And now you and my husband are on fun texting terms. So we've become really good friends over the last couple of years. And I think very highly of you. And I'm just so excited to finally have you on my show.
Thanks, first of all. It was an honor to get you Fountain Diet Coke. I was happy to do it. But I am a massive Stillman family fan.
Aww.
So I'm excited to be here. It's going to be fun. Fired up.
Oh, man. So good. Well, so I read your book, Your Jesus is Too American. It came in the mail as we were leaving for the airport to go to Italy. And I was like, well, this is serendipitous because now I know what I'm reading. And my kids made fun of me because, they get on a plane and they're immediately like, we're going to just binge watch movies for 9 hours or whatever. And my husband is the same way. And nope, not me. Your girl binge read your entire book. I finished it somewhere over the Swiss Alps. And it was as good as I knew it would be. And so it's a very tall order for me today to try to I underlined so much, I highlighted so much that I wanted to talk to you about. And I didn't even know where to start. So I asked my husband, I said, what would be the first question I should ask Steve? And he said, I know. And that is, why do you hate America? So could you please answer that question as to why you, Steve Bezner,
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you, John, for that hard-hitting question. I actually think that I pretty explicitly say in the opening how much I love America.
Yeah, I know.
But I think that that's pretty funny. And that actually is, it's kind of one of those deals where whenever you love America and Jesus, people think, well, of course, you're in Texas. You're required to do that by law. But I am excited to talk about this with you today. I think we're going to have fun.
Oh, man. Okay. Yeah. He was like, you got to ask him first off why he hates America and maybe also why he hates Jesus.
Okay.
Just kidding. Okay. Well, so the real first question is actually the question I ask all my guests. And that is, would you give us the Steve 101, the Stevie B 101? Tell us who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are today.
Okay. Very good. So I'm the pastor of Houston Northwest Church. I have been the pastor at this church since January of 2013. So not quite 12 years yet, having just a great time serving here in Houston. I'm not a native Houstonian. I grew up in a small town in North Texas, almost into Oklahoma, right on the Red River, the border between Texas and Oklahoma. I was raised attending church. My family is, very strong in their faith. But I think that my path into the ministry was kind of a little more circuitous, I guess would be the right way to put it. I didn't really plan on doing that. I thought I was at one point, going to serve in the military. Another point, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Another point, I thought I was going to be a politician. These all, are things that are very different than being a pastor. But the Lord called me into ministry. And basically, I never really looked back. My wife, Joy, her father was a pastor for 50 years. So she has been a massive help to me in many respects. Joy and I served in a couple of other churches. I served in a church in a small town in West Texas whenever I was in seminary. I was associate pastor and student pastor at a church in another small town in East Texas. We planted a church in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then, like I said, almost 12 years ago was when Houston Northwest called. And we have been here and having a blast. So, yeah, we're, and I guess I should mention we have two sons. And they're adults now. I have a 23-year-old and a 20-year-old. And, yeah, so there you go.
I love it. Okay, so you obviously, this is your first book, which, by the way, congratulations.
Thank you.
For birthing a book child. And it's different than birthing a human child, but it is a birth of sorts. And so I know how much like labor and love and like I said, I think before we started recording, just like this is hard and holy work that you have been called to. And so I briefly mentioned it, but the book is, for the listeners, it's called Your Jesus is Too American, Calling the Church to Reclaim Kingdom Values Over the American Dream. And I know personally that this book kind of was birthed actually out of a sermon series that you did at Houston Northwest. And it's funny because you did that sermon series basically like right after you and I had met. And so I started listening to your sermons. And so I remember then when you told me, like, I loved that sermon series. It was called The Upside Down Kingdom of Jesus. And I loved listening to that sermon series. And I remember thinking, like, sending so many of the messages to friends and my husband. And then I remember you saying, like, I think God is actually calling me to kind of write a book out of this. And so would you kind of just tell that story of how it all came to be and how, like, in doing that series and in doing the work through it, you kind of came to the seed of the idea for this?
Yeah. Okay. So the short answer, which sounds kind of weird, was like I just really felt like the Lord told me to write the book about the kingdom of God. But the kind of the longer answer, I really noticed in pastoring that the people, not just in my church, but when I would talk to other friends who were pastors, they would really feel like the people in their congregations and our congregation were being discipled by other cultural forces. And I think that probably the most common thing that you would hear is people say things like, well, they're being discipled by cable news, MSNBC, Fox News, that sort of thing. But what I began to recognize was it wasn't just, cable news. We're being discipled by the ease with which I can have Amazon drop something on my front porch, the ease with which my iPhone can handle a number of my tasks, the way in which we are more and more separate and we have faux community but not real community. And all of these things just really started to kind of come together in my mind to say, this is creating sort of a separate reality, and we need the picture of reality that Jesus gave. And so that was really where the book was born, was with an idea to say, let's talk about the reality that Jesus teaches, and what would that look like for us to live in the 21st century. So that's kind of the genesis of the book.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about that. And obviously that's the whole message of the book. And you use the Sermon on the Mount as kind of the, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for? Like undergirds all of it. Is that the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, like the foundation, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, the foundation is the Sermon on the Mount. And I love that you talk about how the Sermon on the Mount really is the foundational and just like almost encapsulates all of Jesus's ministry and mission in that one sermon. And it's so interesting that literally this morning, as I was doing some reading for seminary, and in one of my seminary books, because it was like one of the books that I'm reading is literally what to expect in seminary. In the chapter on like the second chapter about like what to expect in seminary, it was talking about how when you're in seminary, so often like you're going to start to feel like the things that you brought with you, like your presuppositions, your preconceived notions, your whatever, like your denominational background, all of those things will start to be challenged. And so it talked about in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus talks about and you mentioned this in your book as well, is like how 6 times he says, you have heard it said that, but I say to you. And it's this encapsulation of you have got to start reframing your thinking of what you know, and you're reframing your thinking of the American culture. And I mean, I think that applies to so many areas of life, but especially in our Christian walk. And so that sort of, I felt like, was like the thesis of your whole book is this, you have heard it said that, but I say to you. And so what does Jesus say to us in all these different areas? And so you break it down into different areas. But the first thing I kind of wanted to bring up is, I think it's in the second chapter where you're talking about your mentor, Bob Roberts Jr., who says, pastors ask, how's my church? Where we should be asking, how's my city? And thinking about how do we as Christians impact our community. And so often, like you said, when we allow cable news, when we allow all these other things to disciple us rather than being discipled by Jesus, then we start impacting our communities and our cities differently.
Yes.
So can you kind of unpack that a little bit? Because I think that's a good starting place for us.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Molly. Thanks for asking that. So Bob Roberts was a longtime pastor of Northwood Church in Keller, Texas. You can Google him, find all kinds of interesting information. He's written several books. But Bob really opened my eyes to a new reality of the kingdom of God. And he really helped me understand that one of the things that most pastors do is they try to start a worship service and they try to manage an organization, when the purpose of a church is to provide faithful witness for Jesus in the midst of a community that often wants to ignore Jesus and ignore his way. And so that was the question that he really posed to us. He trained me and how to plant and how to pastor. And he said, most pastors are always focusing on their church. So how many people do we have on Sunday? What was the offering on Sunday? What events are on the calendar? And I want to be clear. I ask all those questions on a regular basis because I am a pastor and we do have to keep the doors open. However, he really pushed me to realize that missionaries think about their city and how to reach their city, and that pastors really have to think that way as well. And it will push you, I think, in a good way, and it should push not just pastors, but Christians in general, to look at their community and say, what is it that my city needs the most, my community needs the most from the way of Jesus? Because over and over, I'm in Texas, so there's a lot of churches down here, but I think the thing that makes our church a little unique is that we're always focused on trying to embody the kingdom way of Jesus in the middle of the city. And I think that is something that anybody can achieve no matter where they live. And you can have a church of 5 people and you can embody the kingdom. And I really think that is the key component of what it means to be faithful in the 21st century, to try to embody this new way of life and to cast a vision for other people about ways that they might be able to live.
Yeah. Well, obviously, the title says it all. Your Jesus is too American. And I remember when you announced it, and the internet was already forming their opinions about what your book was about before it was even released and before they'd read it.
That does happen sometimes on the internet, yes.
A little bit. The Al Gore's internet is wild streets. It's just it's the wild, wild west. But it's no accident that this book is coming out in a time where we are in a, yet another heated political season. And for those that are listening and are like, Molly, are you talking about politics? Because in 8 years, I famously do not talk about politics on here. But we're not talking about politics. But what we're talking about is, how are we being discipled? And the reality is we live in a culture and in a world where politics more often than not disciple us and form our worldviews rather than, as Christians, Jesus discipling us and forming our worldviews, and the Bible forming our worldviews. And Sharon, like our mutual friend Sharon, like she loves this question of like, what is forming you? What is where are you being spiritually formed? And so I think that's so much of what you tackle here is like, how are we being formed, and are we continuously forming ourselves via and being discipled by media and all these things? And then how does that then trickle out into our lives as Christians? And I was glad, because I was going to ask you, like you mentioned, pastors asking about their church, but I think I would love for you to briefly also, just for people listening who are not in ministry, but who call themselves followers of Jesus, how do they view this? Like, how do they begin to think about this way of living their lives when it is so easy? And they might not even be conscious of it, of how much they're being discipled by politics and by the media.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really think that for most people, we envision ourselves living in the middle of a story. And I think that politics gives us a very compelling story. You know, it's easy to think, about issues as the political talking points frame them. And I think we get excited about, fighting for something that we believe is good and right. And I think that everybody loves to fight for what they believe is the right thing to do, and and those kinds of things. And I think that most political operatives and most political campaigns, if they're worth their salt, do a great job of saying, here's a compelling story and you ought to be in the middle of it. But you'll meet people who'll say things like, well, I don't really care about politics, but I guarantee you they have a story that they believe that they are joining as well. And so sometimes that's a sports story. They're really invested in a particular team or their child's team, or they're really invested in their job. They're invested in their business, but they kind of have created a narrative, and then they want to join that narrative, and they want to be, as productive in the middle of that story. The thing that I think that for average believers who are not pastors to take away from this book is it gives you an opportunity to think about what it means to be part of the Jesus story first. I'm certainly not saying don't be civically engaged. I'm not saying don't coach your kids' little league team. I'm not saying any of those things. I am saying the first and most important identity needs to be your identity in Christ and joining into his story. And so if we let him kind of frame reality, then I think that we can find a better way to participate.
Yeah. There's a paragraph I want to read from the chapter called God and Country, which speaks directly to this. And it says, careful readers will note that the kingdom vision of political issues does not cleanly square with the talking points of either of the main political parties in the United States or of many political parties anywhere in the world. Those of us who claim a kingdom vision for politics will invariably feel passionate about issues, but rarely at home in the traditional political confines afforded by culture. Instead, we prophesy and cast vision. To be honest, a kingdom vision of politics will not always provide a clear candidate to vote for in an election. Christians should, in my opinion, study the available candidates and their stances on major issues, pray, and then follow the leading of the Spirit. And so I like literally highlighted and starred that whole paragraph because I feel like you articulated so often of like where I have felt, because I'm going to be real transparent here, guys. So I was both a member of the college Republicans and also worked for a Democratic governor who went on to be a Democratic candidate for vice president years ago. I have voted in every election, and I have never voted a single party. I've voted for third party. I've voted for Democrat. I've voted for Republican. I am a registered independent. And because of that, I get all of the spams from all of the candidates because they're like, oh, look, somebody who's registered unaffiliated, we're just going to spam her. And as you know, and granted, some of that was in a time when I didn't follow Jesus, but especially since I became a Christian, I have really wrestled with this as somebody who does love politics. I mean, I was a political science, almost double major in college because I love politics and I love government and I think it's fascinating. But I realized as I began to walk with Jesus, I was like, I just can't align with any one person. But yet our culture disciples us in such a way that is like, you have to pick one or the other. And you have to pick one candidate and you have to agree with everything that candidate stands for. And if you don't, then you are XYZ or you are labeled XYZ. Or if you're a Christian and you vote for a Democrat, you are not a Christian. Or if you are not a Christian and you vote for Trump, then you're a terrible person. It's wild. It's wild. And yet, when we actually look at the kingdom vision, which you outlined so beautifully in this book, they don't align squarely with either political party. And so that's a really difficult thing for us to navigate. And so set all that up to ask this as practically speaking, as you've written this book, as you've pastored people, as you've had conversations, what does it look like, practically speaking, for the believer, for the follower of Jesus to live in the world but not of it, follow the kingdom values while also being civically engaged? What does that look like in a world that is constantly yelling at us to pick one or the other?
Yeah, it's a real pickle, and I appreciate you asking. I think a couple of thoughts come to mind immediately. The first one would be, as you've already kind of said, not to fall in love with a candidate, but to have Christian position on certain issues. So I don't think it would be surprising for anybody listening today to hear, most Christians tend to have a very quote unquote conservative position, pro-life position with regarding abortion. So that's kind of a standard position in a lot of the Christian community. And so that became like kind of a controlling issue for a certain group of voters. Mm-hmm. Then there's another group of voters who they became very passionate about the plight of the poor. Mm-hmm. And that became a very central issue for another group of voters. What's interesting is that oftentimes those groups of voters are pitted against one another. And I don't know who's going to win the election. I don't know if it's going to be Kamala. I don't know if it's going to be Donald, but I do know that whoever wins on the day after the election, folks are going to wake up and they're going to have a variety of emotions. And I think that if you're a Christian, you'll be able to say, well, I agree with these particular policy points for, let's say, former President Trump, or I agree with these policy points for current Vice President Harris, but I disagree with these other policy points. And so I think one of the best things we can do is focus on issues rather than focusing on the candidate. Mm-hmm. And to say, what does the scripture say about how we ought to care for the poor? What does the scripture say about how we ought to best love our immigrant and refugee neighbors? What does the scripture say about how we ought to best love XYZ? And I think that whenever we focus on that, it gives us a peg on which to hang our hat. I think that a lot of times what ends up happening is, as you've already said, people get so fired up about a party that they forget about the issue. So I think that'd be the first thing, just focus on issues. Yeah. Second thing that comes to mind is to work locally, wherever you are. Like I'm in Houston, and so we have very specific issues here that may or may not be issues that are focused on in your particular community, wherever you're listening from. And I think that one of the things that's been very encouraging for me is to focus on alleviating issues in my community that make sense to me based on my Christian perspective. So at our church, we got really interested in addressing hunger in our community. So we started a community garden, and we take fresh produce into food deserts. We started focusing on partnering with organizations that directly address hunger and directly address poverty and root causes of poverty. We work with organizations that do job training. Those are things that we can do hyper locally, and it doesn't really matter if Trump or Harris wins. We know that we'll continue to do those things because those things will continue to be needed. So it's not a putting your head in the sand ignoring, but it's a recognition that neither candidate is going to completely align with the vision that Jesus gives in the Sermon on the Mount. Finding the places where you agree, working in that direction, and then finding the places where you disagree and working towards the Jesus vision in those spaces as well. So hopefully that makes sense for your listeners.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's really interesting, and I don't remember, so correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't memorize your book, even though I did read the whole thing. I don't remember if you talked about this specifically, but actually a couple of years ago, my husband actually gave a sermon kind of a little bit about politics, but not really. And he talked about one of the things that was so interesting when we really look at Jesus's intentionality in who he called to be his disciples. And you look at Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot. And these are two people who are the complete opposite of the political spectrum, where you have Simon Z, who is probably into QAnon, and you have Matthew the tax collector, who is like all up in everything government, and how these two people at some point both died for the same thing. Yes. They were both martyred for their belief and call and following Jesus. And yet, politically, they were on complete opposite ends of the spectrum. And how Jesus' intentionality in doing that and in calling these people to him, to walk with him and be discipled by him during his earthly ministry was clearly so intentional, and how even we can't even really wrap our minds around how radical this would have been for other people to see, wait a second, a zealot and a tax collector are following the same rabbi. Like, what? Like, how mind-blowing that would have been. And that is, again, it's just this like modeling of Jesus's upside down kingdom. And I feel like that speaks directly to your point of how when whoever wins on November 6th or whatever the day is after the election, instead of like just being up in arms, because the reality is one of them is going to win and people are going to be mad and people are going to be happy. But our job as Christians is, what does it look like to abide in Jesus's kingdom and then move forward? And how can we collaborate? How can we, if we are the tax collector, if we're Matthew, how can we find Simon the Zealot and both be on the same page? Or if we're Simon the Zealot, how can we find Matthew the tax collector and both be on the same page, working towards the same goal? In reality, that's really difficult. But yeah, I don't know. I just, as you were saying that, that's what I was kind of envisioning.
No, I think it makes sense, Molly. And I think, too, that the tendency, particularly post-COVID, is for us to move into groups where we all look the same. Particularly from an ideological perspective. We want to go to church, and we want to live, and we want to play in spaces where everyone basically thinks the same that I do. And Tim Alberta's written a book recently where he talks about the fact that one of the strengths of the Christian community in the past, particularly in the United States, was that it was one of the few spaces where people intentionally and regularly rubbed shoulders with people who had different views than they did.
Yeah.
People from different educational backgrounds, political backgrounds, racial backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that right now, and you, I know for sure have, and I'm sure some of your listeners have heard of this kind of recent phenomenon, the Great Sort, where people are sort of sorting themselves into homogenous groups. And one of the great things about the kingdom that Jesus models in choosing the zealot and the tax collector is that he says, I want all of these folks to submit that identity under allegiance to me. And to me, that's one of the most beautiful things that we can envision in the church.
Yeah. Side note, are you a Chosen fan? Have we talked about this? Do you watch The Chosen?
Okay, you're going to embarrass me. We haven't started it, but like, I know. It's terrible. But like, you are like, you are one of 20, 30 people who have shamed me and said we need to watch it.
Yeah,
So I need to watch
right
it.
Right now, tonight, you enjoy season 1, episode 1, catch up, binge it, and then we can discuss.
The look of disgust and disappointment on your face, I think, was enough to push the needle over for me.
I'm going to get stank face wrinkles because
wow, it was bad. It was a good stink face.
Well, I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert. Okay. So, I believe it is in season 3. Season 4 just came out. I'm pretty sure it's season 3. I don't know if you've read the Bible or not, but there's this time when, Jesus sends out his disciples 2 by 2,
Okay. I've read that, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, when, one thing that was so interesting is because again, what I think The Chosen does so beautifully, and this is not an episode or conversation about The Chosen, but I just feel like because you haven't watched it, I have to give this context. And for those that have not watched it, even though I feel like I talk about this show all the time on this podcast, because I just want everybody to watch it. What I think The Chosen does so beautifully is it takes just a little bit of, what we can glean from scripture. And then I feel like the writers and producers do a really good job of creating a backstory that is both theologically and historically plausible. And so in that scene where Jesus is like, okay, I'm going to send out you guys 2 by 2 to go heal and cast out demons and, open the eyes of the blind, all this stuff. I'm going to send you out to go do this stuff. He pairs them up. Now in the Bible, we don't know how they paired them up, really. We know maybe a couple, but right when he started to do that, John goes, he's going to put Matthew and Simon the Zealot together. He's going to put Matthew and Simon the Zealot together. He called it. And sure enough, Jesus pairs up Matthew and Simon the Zealot to go out and cast demons. Obviously, biblically, we don't know that that was the case, but I thought it was so perfect because again, and then it cuts to the other disciples and they're like, wait, you just put those 2 together? And Simon the Zealot at first is like, well, what do you mean? Because he gets called after Matthew. So he doesn't know that Matthew was once a tax collector. And they're like, Matthew is a tax collector. And it just the look on Simon the Zealot's face is like, what? Anyway, it just so beautifully illustrates because all the other disciples are like, Jesus, are you nuts? I cannot believe you just paired up those 2 to go out together. But it ends up being this beautiful picture of, again, walking out this vision of my people are going to be in allegiance to me and not their like respective political parties or their respective, ideological views. I just think it's really beautiful. Anyway, that was just a little side note, and yet another plug as to why you need to watch this show.
Well, I love it though, Molly, because don't you think that if Jesus's command is to love your enemy, right? I mean, that is 101. I think that one of the things that we really struggle with, I was going to say in the American church, but it's just people.
Yeah.
Is whenever Jesus gives a command to love our enemy, one of the things that we strategically do day by day is we work to put ourselves in spaces where we are nowhere near enemies.
Yeah.
And so loving your enemy means that you have to be in proximity to them. And so it does not surprise me that Jesus would do that in the show, because in the Bible, he's doing it all the time. He's getting close to people to be considered his enemies. So I love that. I think it's beautiful and creative.
Yeah, it's so good. Anyway, this is just yet another plug, me shaming you. You need to watch it.
Okay.
And then text me and Job when you start watching it.
Very good.
And have a box of tissues ready. Okay, I'm just going to let you know. Just have a box of tissues. Just have it ready on hand. I don't want to call him out, but somebody in this family who is also not me cries when he watches it. So all the time. Well, my kids always say, they're like, well, I've never seen Dad cry. And there's 2 episodes in particular I can remember looking over, and he was misty. There was some mist. And the kids were like, is that all Dad does when he cries? Is there mist? Anyway.
I'm grateful to have this blackmail information for John Stillman. This is good.
Yes. Yeah. It was the episode, for people wondering, like, which episode was it? When Jesus calls Nathaniel. When I saw you under the fig tree. Oh. Okay. Anyway, we're moving on. I won't talk about The Chosen anymore, but I do feel like it is very apropos to this particular conversation.
This episode brought to you by
The Chosen. No, I mean, this is par for the course for me, is because I tell everybody I know about it. Anyway. Okay. So back on track. This is what happens on my show, and my listeners are used to it at this point, is sometimes I just digress and then I end up veering off, and then I just have to bring myself back. All that to say is, as we begin to, as Christians, again, really understand the kingdom of God, like what the kingdom of God is, what Jesus is trying to bring to earth in, as I love that you guys always use the word, in Houston as it is in heaven, here as it is in heaven, as we are bringing the kingdom down. And I think actually this is one of the things I took away from your book that I had never really thought about before, is how you talk about, like, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, like, so often I feel like a lot of pastors preach this, is like, what is to come, like what is in heaven currently, not that we can actually have the kingdom of God here on earth right now, that this is just a foretaste of what is to come in heaven and all of that. And so, but that, again, that's really difficult, because especially in our American culture, we're just juggling all of these things. We have our occupational lives, our emotions, our relationships, the economy, like our culture, our intellect and beliefs, like, especially like, I live in an area that is highly educated. Like, we have, within a 15-minute drive of my house, I have Duke and UNC, and then a 20-minute drive is NC State. And then, we have major universities and major hospitals that are within 30 minutes of here. And so half of my neighbors are like, have their 4 PhDs, you know what I mean? And so, like, it's a super highly educated area. But because of that, and I think Sharon has actually talked with you about this too, like, it's this challenge of sometimes you're up against people who are so full of head knowledge. And yet, especially those that are full of head knowledge but call themselves Christians, they have been formed more by their head knowledge rather than by the kingdom of God. And that is a really difficult thing to break, to kind of shed. And so I'm curious for you, especially like as you've walked with people and pastored people and been in ministry all these years, and as you counsel people, what do you see as you're counseling people as they're like trying to like break free from some of those things that kind of get in the way, and how you counsel people and work people through that or guide them through that? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that the beautiful thing that Jesus says in his very first sermon is he says, repent for the kingdom of God is at hand. And what he's trying to say is it's at hand. It is right here. And most people, whether they have a PhD or they are digging ditches, they would love to experience the power of God in their lives. Like they just want that.
Yeah.
And if they see something that looks different, that looks unique, they will be intrigued, and it doesn't matter what level of education or lack of education they have, they will be drawn into it. And so this is why I think that Jesus gives us this vision, right? If you're radically generous, if you're bold in reconciliation and peacemaking, if you are a force for love within a community that is often hate-centric, then you will catch the attention of people. And whenever people step into that community, they'll experience the power of God. And one of the things that I think we've been very blessed to see in our church, and I think one of the things that I think that Jesus was doing when he was teaching the Sermon on the Mount and when he was teaching people initially, was he was trying to teach a way of life where people would experience the provision and the power of God in their daily lives. And I really think that whenever you talk to people who are hyper educated, or people who are skeptical, or maybe people who are just hardworking blue collar folks who are super busy and just trying to scrape by, you want to point them to the way of Jesus because it gives them firsthand experience with the living God.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. As you were talking, like, I'm going to ask you this, and I don't even know if you're going to know how to answer it. So if you don't, we can just cut this. But for you, as somebody who has born and raised in Texas, you've lived in basically every corner of Texas, and Texas has its, Texans love Texas. There is
do. Oh man, we love Texas.
People who love Texas more than Texans.
Amen.
And I'm not going to lie, I love Texas as well. Did I tell you, by the way, we're getting a Buc-ee's? Side note, we're getting the very first North Carolina Buc-ee's.
The kingdom of God truly is at hand. All right,
the kingdom of God is at hand here on earth as it is in heaven when we get a Buc-ee's. But so again, you born and raised Texas. I know you love Texas. I know you love America. You even mentioned at the beginning of this that you had, pipe dreams of one day maybe, going into running for office or something. So you have probably at some point, and I would dare say you would admit this, like, you have been discipled by Texas culture. You've been discipled by politics in small town Texas and small town churches. And yet I feel like you live out what you write about more than anybody I know. I mean, I don't know you super well, but I feel like we know each other pretty well. And you are somebody who, what I hear you teach in a sermon on a Sunday morning, you are living that out. And what you write about in this book about, reclaiming kingdom values over the American dream, you live that out. But I have to guess that this is something that did not come easy for you based on where you grew up and how you grew up and the culture that you were raised in. Am I right in assuming that? And if so, what has that walk been like for you personally to kind of reclaim kingdom values over the Texas dream, the American dream, running for office? Like, how have you personally had to kind of probably battle against that?
It has been painful. It's been really hard. I think that because of the way that I was raised, I grew up in church in a world where basically church and America were essentially at the same level, and Texas too.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all one big mishmash in my mind. And it was not until I got older, I really began to study the Bible, began to read it, and recognize that a lot of the things that I had assumed were good and right were actually condemned by Jesus. Specifically, and I mentioned this in the book, but I had been raised not intentionally, but in and around just racist attitudes my entire life. I mean, and I'm not proud of that. I am ashamed of it, to be honest with you. I'm even more ashamed that I don't think I fully comprehended the level of racial or racist, rather, attitudes that I had in my heart until I was probably in college. but I began to recognize the more that I was studying the Bible, the more I was realizing Jesus had a really specific way that he wanted us to live. And to be honest with you, the way that I had proceeded with life and probably continued to proceed with life for, say, the first 20, 25 years of my life was I'm going to go after anything that I want, money, power, whatever, and then just, put a Jesus sticker on it.
Yeah.
Put that Jesus fish on it or slap a bumper sticker on it. That's right. And I wasn't honest about the fact that trying to radically claim the way of Jesus would, in essence, require me to rethink pretty much everything. Now, I appreciate your kind words, Molly. I could certainly bring Joy on here, and she could tell you all the ways that I don't live what I preach. And certainly the church staff could tell you the same thing. But I will say that I have been trying, as I have become more and more aware of the kingdom, I've been trying to learn what does it mean to take the way of Jesus seriously. And I have a long way to go, but I do think that that is one of the things that Christians in the 21st century will really make the most difference with if we will take the way of Jesus seriously. Because I think that the world in the West is filled with people who already seek after what everybody else seeks after. But if you start taking the way of Jesus seriously, you will get the attention of others, and you'll really probably get the attention of your family, and it'll begin to shape some opinions. So yeah, it's been a painful journey, but a good journey.
Yeah. Well, again, just interesting that's kind of where I felt like I was led to ask you that. And then your answer is just top of mind, or I guess topical, appropriate for me right now. So like one of the classes, I think I just mentioned this also in my previous interview that I had this morning. So one of the classes I'm taking is Intro to Mentored Formation, but it's basically a spiritual formation class. And so at the seminary, you are required, as long as you're in seminary, at least one of your classes every semester has to be in spiritual formation. And the whole goal of that is like the seminary was basically saying what we realized is years ago, I think they implemented this about 10 or 15 years ago at Denver Seminary, is they were looking at that across the country, that in general, seminaries and divinity schools were cranking out students who were leaving with these MDivs and their masters and whatever, or their seminary degrees, and they were going into the workplace or into ministry, and they had all this head knowledge like we were talking about, but they had no spiritual formation. They didn't know how to actually like believe and implement in their own lives the biblical truths that they had spent years studying.
Yes,
Go ahead, respond to that.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think that that's one of the dangers of the academic study of religion is you get a lot of content, you fall short in character.
Yeah. And so what Denver, in trying to combat that, they basically implemented this spiritual formation, mentored formation track that every student at Denver has to go through. So you cannot graduate from Denver Theological Seminary without taking these classes. And so I went into it, like my very first class, I was like, I don't know what this is about, like mentored formation. Like, I don't know what that's. And I'm 2 weeks in and I'm already like, my mind is blown. But one of the things that we were actually talking about yesterday was like, kind of I was mentioning earlier about like in our life with God, we have all of these different areas, our physical, our intellect, our beliefs, our cultural engagement, the, economic relationships, emotions, our jobs, all of these things. And so like realizing that every one of those things can be holy. Every one of those things can be part of ministry. If everything we do in Jesus, we do it all to the glory of God. What does it actually look like practically to abide in Jesus in every one of those areas? And so like talking about like, how do we implement everyday practices for spiritual formation? So like, how do we implement daily practices in our own lives so that we are actually taking what we study seriously and implementing it into our own lives? And maybe that looks like observing the Sabbath, which for a lot of people as Christians, they don't do, and they're really, they struggle with. Or what are you doing like as a everyday practice to pray or commune with the Holy Spirit, or, what grows and nurtures your humility? And it's something that just even in like one class I've been thinking about, and like, how do I implement that in my own life? But I feel like that very much speaks just to your point of like, as you began to study the word and really be challenged by it, which we should be if we're digging into scripture, like we should constantly be challenged. Our toes should constantly be stepped on. What does it look like for us to actually implement what we're learning and being formed, like spiritually formed by those things? And I think that is so much what the heart of this book is too, is like, how are we implementing spiritual practices to challenge how the American culture is discipling us? That's hard. It is so hard because it's so much easier to just open up Instagram or Twitter or X or whatever, or turn on cable news and to just be bombarded with these things rather than learning how to filter those things out and be bombarded by the word of God instead.
Yeah, and you're on it, Molly. And I really think that's why Jesus gives, I think, very practical things, generosity, peacemaking, enemy love. All of those things are so hard to do, but they require action. They're not just theory. Yeah. And now I went to seminary, I got a degree in theology. I care about theology. But Jesus talks a lot about lived theology, not just theory. And I think that is huge for us to recognize, that he wants us to embody it. And one of the spaces I think that much of the American church would benefit from is to step into the lived space. What does it look like for us to truly live this, like you were describing?
Yeah. Well, man, okay. We're running out of time, but I have one last thing, and I feel like this is actually the perfect place to end. And I have to tell you that when I just read your chapter titles, when I read the title of your last chapter, Get Busy Dying, I was like, please tell me that is a Shawshank reference. And I was so happy when it was, because it is a favorite film of John Stillman and I. Truly a classic, transcendent film, arguably one of the best films ever made.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so your last chapter, Get Busy Dying, is Jesus on finding life in death. And it's the shortest chapter, but it's also just the perfect bow on the book, and really unpacking this whole like dying to self. And then this is the last thing I promise I'm going to say about seminary. I'm really into, like, I've got a lot of things in my head right now. So when I was talking to somebody back in the spring, when I was praying about, when I found out that I got accepted into the seminary, and then I was like, I am terrified. I don't know if I should do this. And I asked a girl who is she's 1 year ahead of me. So she's in the program a year ahead of me. And so I said to her, like, am I going to die? Like, am I going to die? And she said to me, and I will never forget this, and I need to actually send her a message and be like, thank you for saying this, because it has helped me frame my time in seminary. But I'm sharing all this because I think it's to your point of this last chapter. And she said, you won't die, but some things will have to die. And I was like, okay, I heard that. That'll preach. And she's right. And I'm already like thinking about like, what in my life, here are the things that I know I don't want to die. And that's my marriage, my children, and my involvement in church. And so I've had to ask myself, like, and obviously my relationship with Jesus, that's first. It's a given. But if those are the things that in my life that I value the most, is my relationship with Jesus, my relationship with my husband, my children, and my church and community. So everything else outside of that doesn't fall under that, some of that stuff's going to have to die. And it might be stuff I really like, And I think that is the Christian life, is that sometimes like some things that we really love have to die.
Absolutely.
So will you kind of talk about that, like why you decided to end the book on that note, like this book on that note?
Yeah, because I think that everything that Jesus commands lines up exactly with the advice that your fellow student gave you, which is you may not die, but some things in you are going to have to die. If you're going to be generous, you're going to have to decide to keep less for yourself. If you're going to choose to be a servant, then you are going to forego power and opportunities that you could seize it. If you are going to choose sexual purity in the midst of an age that is sexually charged, you're going to forego a lot of opportunities. And we could go on and on. But I mean, you're going to die to yourself in ways that you don't really want to.
Yeah.
My big idea, I guess, my big argument, my contention, if you will, is that it's a richer experience to be human if you follow the way of Jesus than it is if you follow the American dream.
Mm.
And when you die to the American dream and you embrace the way of Jesus, you actually end up having a far better experience of being human than you could ever imagine.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if I could drop this microphone, I would, because or you could drop yours, then you would. I don't know. All that to say is I think that was the perfect way to end. And here I have ruined it.
You're the best, Molly. You are the best.
Yeah. I just think that perfectly encapsulates everything that we talked about. And like I said, I could talk to you for 7 more hours. For everybody listening, because Steve is way too humble to do this himself, I'm going to tell you right now, go pre-order this book. So when this airs, the book will not be out yet. It comes out October 8th. October 8th. And so you can pre-order it wherever books are sold. You can get it from your local indie bookstore and they'll have it for you. Amazon, all the places. You can pre-order it and it will be on your doorstep the day it releases. And Your Jesus is Too American. Please go buy this book and buy a copy for your friend, for your pastor, for all of those things, because I really believe that this message is such a needed message in the church right now. And I just want it to get into as many hands as possible. So please go pre-order this book because let me just tell you, it blessed me, it encouraged me, and I had already listened to the sermon series. So I feel like I learned a lot. So don't think oh, if you're I'm going to say this to the Houston Northwest people too, go buy this book. Yeah, he's way too humble to do it himself. So I'll do it for you.
Thank you, Molly.
Thanks for being here. And thanks for being my friend. You're awesome.
It's been a pleasure and I'm super honored. Thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.